Had this short-term negative correlation return. It's been a positive correlation since the Fed began cutting. We've had this positive correlation, and now, actually, drew that too high. We've had this positive correlation, and now we're flipping back to a short-term negative correlation. We see the S&P dropping, and we see the 10-year yield rising. But this is the catalyst right now, at least so far. There could be other things, could be earnings, tensions in the Middle East, that we could see rattle the markets further. Now this is it. The 200, again, we've got a candle of indecision. If this starts going back down, could see the market go back and try to fill the gap, or even try to make a form of divergence on the awesome oscillator, which I'll be showing you in this video. But this is what's rattling the markets last 3 days here this week. We saw some selling pressure back to the 10 period, tried to bounce twice. Monday and Tuesday. Today we broke the 10 period and we broke the trend line, and I'll show you that. We're testing another trend line, including the shadow. I'll show you all that in this video. This is the catalyst for the selling so far. If it starts coming back down, we'll see if we remain with the negative, short-term negative correlation. We try to fill the gap, or do we try to challenge the high and still get a divergence, more recent price action on those awesome oscillators, which you'll see in the video. 10-year is forming negative divergence here on the histogram, and almost a Class B divergence with 2 equal peaks there on the RSI. But it's on a couple of indicators. The doji could be a continuation of reversal. I'll be watching if we drop back below that 200. Same thing with the dollar, and again, we're above that 200. We've seen it go parabolic since the Fed cut. I think the dollar pulls back and it goes higher. I think the yields go lower. The Giants' #1 fan pointed out to me yesterday, we're coming up here to the same levels where we were at, where we saw the July peak for the NASDAQ. Here's the S&P here, just after the NASDAQ, but again, we're going to be watching to see if we get a pullback with the dollar, with the 10-year yield. Eventually, does that complete a topping process and eventually moving down, seeing the market move down with them? It has broken out and back tested in the weekly time frame. Bouncing off the 50-month moving average, bouncing off the 200-week moving average, it's likely going to pull back and get a higher low. Your yield will eventually move to new lows, in my opinion. This is what's rattling the market right now. If we begin to turn back down below these 200-period moving averages, if we do, then we'll be watching to see what happens. Do we get a confirmation of fall through to today's sell-off immediately, or do we go back and try to fill that gap, possibly make new highs? If we form a divergence on the awesome oscillator, watch the video all the way through and you'll see what I'm talking about. Got a couple different ways. The future, you don't know the future. I'm looking at technical levels, mathematically based indicators, trend lines. Even with the volatility this week, so far, we're still in a risk-on environment. We'll see if that changes. That's what I'll be watching. Does that change this week? Does that change next week? The trend is still positive at the moment. For the S&P 500, that could quickly change. We'll be watching, again, the 2 trend lines I'm talking about in this video. One of them we're breaking. The other one we've come right back to, which includes the shadow, the one that we're testing. Including the shadow, we've already broken it. I'm showing you this because, again, if we're going to start a bigger sell-off, a reversal here that's going to give us a bigger sell-off, a downtrend, we're going to end up moving from a risk-on to a risk-off. We're not there yet. Watching to see what happens for the balance of the week. Watching the gap fill. Do we go back up and fill it, or do we just continue slide and get a follow-through, or confirmation, I should say, and follow-through to today's sell-off? Quickly, Nvidia is down nearly 3% today. It's testing the 10 period. Getting rattled by yields surging. Again, I'm looking for this double top on Nvidia. Is the peak in here? Conversion's now done, or do we buy a little more time? Again, if Nvidia does complete a double top immediately, then that could put pressure on NASDAQ, something I'm watching. Little divergence is completing on the stochastic and the histogram, cause the MACD to roll over. We'll see, again, do earnings or tensions in the Middle East or yields rattle the market further this week or on into next week. Watching Nvidia closely. Again, still watching the VIX bouncing off the 50-period moving average. It is holding above the 50 as the 50 is above the 200 still. This is not good for the market. Eventually, we're going to get a sell-off. Maybe that's starting right now. Looking for clues. We were up at the highest just under 10%. We ended up under 6% for the session. To see if eventually we see the stochastic recycle back up. It's not quite there yet. Do we eventually see the MACD firm back up around the center line or go slightly negative and firm back up? Volatility returns immediately. We'll see that happen immediately. If we buy a little bit more time going back up to fill the gap or even trying to form a divergence on the awesome oscillator, then we might buy a little bit more time. But watching to see, will we remain above that 50-period moving average? Now, quickly, I've talked about these divergences between the NASDAQ and the S&P. In the upper window, I have the S&P. In the lower window, I have the NASDAQ. We had a divergence here in our most recent price action. And again, NASDAQ filled the gap at the 20,400 area, and then it made a lower high. S&P moved slightly higher. Have another potential divergence. We had a divergence at the July peak. We've had a divergence at these other peaks, other bottoms, tops and bottoms. We often get divergences, and again, this is going all the way back into the summer of 2023. Divergences often mark turning points. We now have a larger one that could be marking a major top. Whether this divergence is done yet, we'll see. But again, I think NASDAQ will make a lower high and S&P will make a higher high. Please support the channel with the link directly below. That allows me to be able to provide you this information. Sorry, tongue-tied there. Find the information useful. You like the charts, and you will. I hope you like them as much as I do. If you find the information useful, please support the channel today. I do need to hear from you in order to make it work. Follow the link below to take you to a secured site, and you can donate any amount you want. Take a moment to do that. I would appreciate it. I don't have any sponsors. I choose not to have sponsors. I don't want to sell you stuff. So please consider helping out today. I thank you for your consideration for that. Just quickly, I want to show you the weekly chart on this week. We're down about 67 points. We're down 1.15% for the week so far. We'll see how we close the week out. I told you we were coming up and we were slamming up into this trend line right here. I told you we could overthrow it. Or we could just turn off of it, but I was looking for a peak in this area, and we're now seeing the RSI turn down. MACD, again, will eventually roll over. By the time that happens, we'll probably have a pretty good sell-off. We'll be watching to see, do we break the 6-week winning streak this week? We buy a little bit more time. We're watching that. Again, earnings, tensions in the Middle East, the surging 10-year yield. It's rattling the market right now, so we'll be watching these things closely. I wanted to show you this chart. You watch the video all the way through at the end. I'll be talking about the sequence counts if you want to see that. Those counts could very well be playing out right now. Watch the video all the way through. Okay, the market continues to be rattled by the surge in the 10-year Treasury note yield. I had a great length and detail talking about this yesterday. A lot of time on it at the end of the video. I talked about the dollar and the 10-year yield. And we've seen the market rattled by that all week. We got the sell-offs back to the 10-period moving averages, and then S&P would rebound. Today we got more volatility with that, breaking some trend lines that we've been talking about. I'll tell you what's going on with that. The Dow hit it down just under 1%, ended down 410 points, down about 1.5%, over 500 points at the lows of the session. P ended down 0.92%, again, down over 1.5% at the lows of the session, ended down almost 54 points, below 5,800 at 57.97. NASDAQ was down 1.60%. The NASDAQ 100 was down about 2.25% at the lows of the session. Russell down 0.79%, down almost 18 points. The VIX, which went up to just under 10%. It was the 9% area, and then it turned back down. It ended up 5.71%. It ended up just over 1 point higher to 19.24. Remember, between the 18 and the 20 area, where the market starts having problems, and when we start surging above that 18 to 20 area, when you get your real volatility. After hours, we got Tesla. That's helping NASDAQ, and after hours, sorry about that, I had to take a call. Nevertheless, I digress. We have Tesla shares jumping in after hours. Tesla during the session was down almost 2%, and after hours, it is up. It is up 9% at the moment. So again, rebound in an attempt to go fill today's gaps or not. Do some technical damage, but I'll show you what I'm looking at. I'll have two scenarios in play. I'll show you what I'll be looking at for the rest of the week. Yesterday, the S&P, and this is the 5-minute chart, the S&P had gapped lower. We attempted a recovery, and we went back up and we filled the gap. Got above the 200 here in the 5-minute time frame, but it failed, and we gapped lower. Again, the 10-year Treasury yield rattling the market at the moment. We dropped down, had some divergences form up again, form here on the RSI, but the shorter term time frames, these are short-term price fluctuations. They only gave us bounces, and again, we ended up dropping below the divergence lows each time, and then now had another divergence that developed here that gave us the breakout of this downward trend line. Watching to see if we go back and fill the gap fill up here from yesterday's close. Sold off. We had a gap and go, and you always want to watch a gap on the intraday charts. Is it a gap and go where you gap down and you just keep going? Is it a gap and fill where you gap down, you fill, and then you resume the slide in the direction of the gap? Or is it a gap and trap where you gap down, like we did over here? You gap down and then you turn back up and you move above the gap fill area. On an intraday basis, that was a gap and trap. Gap and go, a gap and fill, and a gap and trap. This is the intraday time frame. So this gap and trap, again, was just short term. These are just short term price fluctuations. A gap and trap time frame, like the daily chart. Today, on an intraday basis, we had a gap and go. So again, we'll be watching this gap, and do we go back and attempt to fill it? Now, we've been watching these rising wedges. I told you we could either go back up to the upper boundary or we could just break down. It could play out either way. We've been watching for clues to see which way it plays out. Well, here, the Dow broke the trend line, upper boundary of the rising wedge. I've excluded the shadow here and dropped below the 20-period moving average, and then we rebounded. And the Dow rebounded off the lows. It was down about 1.5%, closing in on 600 points. And then it rebounded. We dropped down just over 400 points, but we broke the trend line. So again, we'll be watching. Do we get a back test, or do we just keep going? Again, we have some gaps to be watching. Yesterday, we got that candle of indecision in the form of a spinning top. I talked about that yesterday. Told you again, that could give us a continuation of this slide and break down below the trend line. Good market short-term bottom where we attempt to rebound. I've talked about the upper boundary being tested one more time to form those divergences on the awesome oscillator, which I'll show you. Just start selling off. We had this this Class B divergence, almost two equal peaks here, while the Dow went higher. But the breakdown of the rising wedge now, so we'll be watching. Attempt to go fill that gap. In order for divergences on the awesome oscillator to play out, we have to get back above the trend line and stay above it. Lines can change. Watching this closely because we've now done technical damage. S&P did the exact same thing. It went down to that 20 period. It dropped below it. Momentum shift. We lost a 10, but we bounced off the 20 period moving average. The Dow just right at it. S&P moved above it just a bit here, and the lower end of the cloud. And we have a very reliable reversal pattern. Okay. But if I include the shadow, again, we're coming right to that level there. Hang on, my trend line moved on me here slightly. This program, sometimes when you hit save, it moves on you. Right in here, again, we're coming right up to the trend line. We're coming right to the trend line from the low, including the shadow. Again, we get back above this other trend line, then this will become the lower boundary of the rising wedge. So again, watching this closely. Again, momentum signals turning bearish today. Watch the video all the way through. Stuff happening, but it's telling us we're either going sideways or we're now going down, one or the other. We still back test this trend line. I talked about that on the Dow. Or we can move to break this trend line and get a confirmation of this break right here, taking out the 20 period. So we're watching to see how is this going to unfold. Look, I'm looking for a top here and a reversal. Is that now starting? Possibly. I've talked about the two scenarios, either immediate breakdown with this divergence right here of the rising wedge, or buying a little bit more time and going up and hitting the upper boundary and seeing divergences develop on those awesome oscillators. Maybe we get another reference point. We had a little divergence right here on the RSI. Maybe we get another reference point here, and we come down and we get something like that. So we're watching these trend lines. And again, which one is going to be more important? Are we going to bounce off this trend line and get back above the other one? Or is the other one, the breakdown, is it going to hold We go back and fill the gap now. We'll be watching this trend line closely. MACD's rolling over on the Dow, here on the S&P 500. It tried to do it at yesterday's lows, but failed to do it. And again, we rebounded off that 10-period moving average. Now we're seeing a rollover here, so we'll be watching to see what happens. Again, a break of the trend line here, excluding the shadow. Will we continue to hold below the 10-period? We dropped below the 10-period. We were above it and bouncing off of it Monday and Tuesday. Now Wednesday, we're below it. If we remain below it, we can drop further. Then we'll be watching this horizontal support level. This horizontal support level is key, because if you take this level out, that's going to be extremely bearish for the S&P 500. You do have a possible little miniature head and shoulders. If we do continue to sell off down to this level right here, then we'll be watching to see if a right shoulder develops. That's assuming that we get a confirmation to today's breakdown and continue to break down and drop and close below that 20-period moving average. So we'll be watching to see how it unfolds. We do have that gap fill. Do we get the recovery? And again, I'll be watching to see what happens surrounding these two trend lines. If I bring up the 50-period, that's this green line right here, I want to show you that that is right there at that horizontal support level. It's just right underneath it here, or I draw it straight, or maybe just coming in right at it there. You can see we're near that level. We'll probably begin to overthrow it, but again, I'll be watching the 50. If we get a confirmation to today's breakdown, be looking at that gap fill area. Did we fill the gap? And we've got these divergences in play. So again, we'll be watching. Do we get a bigger drop to that horizontal support level? Stochastics now rolled over. We had a divergence in the most recent price action there. We've got this, again, this multiple point divergence, the money flow. It's on a lot of indicators in the daily time frame. And again, divergence in the more recent price action on the RSI. If we end up getting a rally back up, it will lull the nothing's going to happen crowd, the herd, back into a false sense of security, attempt to fill today's gap immediately, or again, if we just continue to sell off, they'll be looking for a bounce at this horizontal support area. Again, right here at around the 5870, or I'm sorry, 56, the 5675 area or so. Now, I told you in yesterday's video that we had the shift in momentum on the 4-hour charts. We got the trend shift, by the way, on those intraday charts. Here in the daily time frame, I told you on Monday we started getting the red awesome oscillator bar, and I want you to be watching to see if we do sell off, does a divergence still attempt to play out? Again, look, here's the deal. Look, rising wedge, if we just break down, we're getting a big sell-off, we could see something like this, where we just start seeing red and we start going negative and you get a bigger sell-off. But if we get red and we start flipping back up and testing that upper boundary, still form a divergence here. That is still possible, so don't rule that out yet. Again, we'll be watching, but again, if we do more technical damage, firming today's sell-off, then maybe all she wrote. But we're looking to the rising wedge would break down. It did. That other trend line on the S&P. What I'll be watching for is, do we get something like what happened over here with my triangle, where we saw the sell-off but then quickly tried to turn back up, and we went a little bit longer, back and forth, forming that triangle that I've talked about. I was telling you we were going to get another new all-time high. Or do we get something like this, where we just start dropping below the 10 period, and then you get a push down, confirming the move, and then the rebound back up, you get rejection at the 10 period. Do we start holding below that 10 period? Here we got above the 10 period, but we get rejection at the 20, and the cloud remained red. So again, we'll be watching to see what happens here. Does this still allow for a divergence to be in play, or do we just see this thing start going negative, and start getting more and more red bars that start taking us down to do more and more technical damage? But I'd be watching the peak over here at the July peak. And again, that is support. We start breaking this level, breaking the 50-period moving average. We're going to be doing major technical damage. Very well could put the nail in the coffin if we end up doing that. So we'll be watching to see what happens here. Momentum did shift today. Will it remain that way? It tells us we're either going sideways, like over here, or we're going down. That's what this is telling us right now. S&P daily chart here. Dow did the same thing. Again, we'll be watching to see what happens. Do we end up dropping down further and then getting some kind of rebound for a lower high? Or it's just remain red, start going negative? Or again, can we go back and fill today's gaps? It can play out a number of different ways. I'm telling you, momentum is shifting. We already saw momentum shift yesterday on the 4-hour charts. Here's the NASDAQ daily chart. Same thing here. We've got the red bars going on with the awesome oscillator. Happened before this week. It happened last week on NASDAQ 100. Again, we went up and filled our gap right there. A week and a half ago, turned down, tried to rebound back up and got a lower high. The NASDAQ is now diverging with the S&P 500, so that might be it. I'll show you that chart in this video. Here, again, we closed below the lower cloud. Little red arrow, little red bar. So again, is this going to be short term? And we still try to go back up and form a divergence on the awesome oscillator, or does it just go red and eventually negative? It's something like this where we dropped over here 16%. Do we start seeing a sell-off? Out the 50, moving towards the 200, moving back towards the August low. Just sideways, like over here, and we get one more push higher. We'll be watching closely. Do we get confirmation to this? Start seeing more and more signals turn bearish. It allows the weekly charts to play out. So again, looking for clues. I expect a top and a reversal. Now the market needs to prove if the top is in or not. It needs to prove it. So we'll be watching now that we have a bearish reversal of conditions with momentum and dropping below the 10 period here, the red line there. Again, here we went back to the 20. We closed just under the 20. We closed just above the 20. We'll be watching the shift in momentum here. Is it a reversal to give us a downtrend? We'll be watching today's gaps as well. Fill, do they not fill? NASDAQ daily chart here. Again, we have these divergences. They're giving us a sell-off. Does it start a reversal? Try to bounce off that other trend line, including the shadow that I'm showing you in this video. And we turned off that upper Bollinger Band that I talked about. S&P moved to a new high, slightly new high. NASDAQ did not. They diverged from one another. So that could mark a turning point there if we start getting confirmation and a follow through and taking out the 20 period moving average, start moving back towards support and moving to test the 50 period moving average. I'm looking for evidence if this is in fact the top. Again, yields go back down and we try to rally back up or something, we still have other things this week and next week that could impact the market. Earnings. We see Israel move forward, respond to the Iranian missile attack from October 1st. That happened this week. Do we see it happen over next week? Could possibly rattle the markets, but does it happen over the weekend when the markets close? So again, we just simply don't know with these geopolitical issues. Again, the question mark with earnings, we'll see what happens. But you have a rising wedge that is potentially breaking down now. Again, this very well could be the start of a reversal if we get further evidence of that. Turning off that upper Bollinger Band, now breaking the trend line, so that may be it. Here, we didn't have momentum shift yesterday. We did get it on other indicators. We did not have it here. We now have it. And again, the short-term swing trend here is gone to bearish. And the question is that going, this is telling us we're either going sideways or down. So if we're going sideways, we could still form a divergence on the awesome oscillator. We could still see a divergence try to form on indicators. But if we start a reversal, could we see something like this? Here we're coming right back to the low point of the cloud right here. Again, you could still end up forming a divergence. So do we just start taking these levels out and get a confirmation and a fall through to the break of the trend line, start seeing oscillators go negative on intraday charts and in the daily time frame? Or do we try to bounce right here like we did over here with the lower high that we got right there? Bounce right here with the lower high. So again, could we rebound back up and get a higher high or lower high? Do we go back up and fill today's gap? Just start breaking down. But right here, possible bounce. We get traction, and again, we're testing in the daily time frame. We're testing the 20 period. And again, excluding the shadow, we've broken the trend line. Including the shadow, we're pretty much right at it. We saw momentum turn bearish at the end of the session yesterday here. Now the trend is turning bearish, and there's a sell signal here. Does it last? It tells us we're either going sideways or we're going down. Something like this, or we're going to get something like this. Watching to see if we attempt to go back up and fill the gap or not. If we do, try to form a divergence in the daily time frame on the awesome oscillator. Have to, it's a possibility, but again, today, short-term swing signals turning bearish after momentum shifting yesterday. Same thing here. We saw the momentum line turn bearish here intraday yesterday. Now we see the trend signal turn bearish, and we've taken out the trend line again, excluding the shadow. We had that divergence right there. Again, could we get a larger divergence? Still possible. Attempt to go back up and fill the gap and move beyond it. So we'll be watching the gap. Now we don't have to fill the gap. We could, so we'll be watching to see what happens. We may fill it at a later date. Try to fill it immediately. We'll be watching to see what happens. If we get a rebound, you can get still a divergence, or you can just fill the gap and then resume and maybe just back test the broken trend line, to fill that gap. Talking about a divergence, if my signals start turning back to bullish immediately here intraday, you could still, and again, we've gone negative. So again, the door is open for a bigger sell-off if we can get a confirmation to today's breakdown. If we start selling off further and get a confirmation and follow through. But if we turn back up to fill the gap, then there's still the possibility of a diversion. So we'll be watching to see how it unfolds. And either way, I'm looking for a top. I've talked about both of these scenarios, whether we hit the upper boundary or start to break down. Right now, we're breaking down. At the moment, that scenario is prevailing. Still don't want to rule out the possibility of a divergence. Oscillator, no guarantee. I talked about both of those scenarios, but here again you can clearly see the sell signals, the bearish signals with momentum yesterday, and now the trend signals for the short-term swing move. So again, we're either going sideways like right here, or we're going down like over here. Live it, love it, learn it. And here got a mixed bag. Momentum is shifting. We got the red bars, but the short-term swing move is still hanging in there. That could change by tomorrow. But again, intraday, we're starting to see some real weakness here. See if the bulls step up to the plate or not. We'll be watching today's gap. Now, we saw the reversal of conditions on the intraday charts. We had momentum, the momentum line flipping here on the S&P during the session at the lows of the session. We had a late day, and at the very end of the session, it got canceled out. It was red, flipping. It still may turn that way tomorrow, but the momentum line dodged the bullet today. Now, we've had these warning signs with the short-term momentum here. This is just looking at momentum. Again, I'm watching to see, do we get other signals? Does the momentum line change, or is it spared? Go back up to fill the gap or try to form a divergence. Again, we have this divergence right here that gave us selling that we're getting now. We have the littler divergence in the more recent price action right here. Again, this still may not be done, but again, we're looking for clues. Again, do we start seeing evidence of it? Do trending signals start changing? We start dropping below the blue line and the cloud. Green line represents a short-term swing move. Blue line represents a short-term trend. Or is this just a pullback? So again, we'll be looking to see, but the momentum line did not flip. Don't have other signals. We did have more over here. We had the sell signals here. We had the red circle of a top. We have to get those signals. Sometimes they do appear at a major peak. Just looking for clues, confirmation and fall through to the break of the trend today on the S&P, or do we buy a little bit more time? And again, momentum, does it go negative? And we start seeing the trend signals begin to turn bearish now. The momentum line turning bearish. Get the reversal of conditions with momentum. We don't have the momentum line flipping. It very well could do it tomorrow, but we did close off of the lows, preventing that from happening. S&P daily. And NASDAQ got a bigger hit. I'm removing the color on the bar so you can see that the momentum line did shift today. And this line representing the swing move also shifted. This is telling us we're either going sideways or down. If the S&P gets that momentum line flipping tomorrow or not. Bars change color, reflecting. And they did over here when we were going sideways. Had this divergence with filling the gap from a week and a half ago. Got a lower high on NASDAQ. Again, will momentum go negative and we get a bigger sell-off? Will the cloud turn bearish, the short-term trend turn bearish, drop below these levels? The S&P join NASDAQ and see the momentum line flip to bearish? Watching to see how it unfolds. Again, this is telling us we're either going sideways or we're going down now. One or the other. Now, last week I warned you we were about to get these 9 counts. It completed on Friday. The 8 bar was the high of the count. We got a bullish inside day. It was not confirmed. I talked about confirmation. Candlesticks are meaningless unless they're confirmed. Our trend line is meaningless unless it gets confirmation and a follow through. Talked about the 9 count there on Friday. Again, we had the 9 count over here before this volatility and before this sell-off. Told you we could see a reversal. Now again, we might go a little bit higher in turn. We might try to turn immediately like NASDAQ did at the July 10th peak. So far, the S&P is turning immediately with that. So again, we'll be watching to see if that high holds. I told you this is showing price exhaustion. So again, the two scenarios I've been talking about, that we break the trend line immediately. Well, we did that today, but we're hitting this trend line. So again, do we try to get back above the broken trend line and still move up here, or do we get a confirmation and a follow through and do more technical damage? Still get the 9 count and go a little bit higher. But we're breaking a trend line. We're starting to see momentum shift now. Again, are we going sideways and we're going to get one more push higher? Or are we going to break down? And really, it's going to depend on what happens next. Regardless of which way it plays out. I've talked about both of these scenarios for a while. Regardless of which way it plays out, again, we're starting the reversal right now, or whether we put the finishing touches on a topping process, again, it's going to end badly. I believe that we're going to sell off sharply. Could be starting right now. I've talked about both of these scenarios for a while with our rising wedge pattern. Okay, we got those 9 counts in the weekly time frame. Early October, I told you we can go a little bit higher and then begin to turn, or we could turn immediately. We went a little bit higher. So again, maybe that's it. What this is telling you is there's price exhaustion. Just like over here, the 13-9 pattern, we went a little bit higher and then we had a sell-off. Again, this 9 count's likely going to produce a reversal. Maybe that's starting right now. We buy a little bit more time, but again, getting more and more sell signals, then again, top very well could be in. Weekly chart of the S&P. The Dow did the exact same thing, by the way. And NASDAQ already got the 13.9 back at the July top. We overthrew it. This is why I was calling for a top back then. I still think that we will get a lower high over here. We do have a 6 of a 9 this week. Guess is we'll end up seeing a reversal. Won't complete the 9 count. My guess is we'll get a lower high. We slammed up into major trend lines in the monthly and weekly time frame back over here. And that's why I thought we had a top over there. But we also had a 9 count in the daily time frame. And the week before we got the 9 count in the daily, we had this 9 count in the weekly the week before. NASDAQ would go back up and fill the gap. We've now done that a week and a half ago, looking for a top, and maybe now that is completing. Quickly, two other things about the S&P 500. We had a 9 over here. It was perfected. There's no P above it because the 7 was a high of the count. It was perfected here. It gave us a pullback. We now have a 9.9 in this most recent price action, which is a reversal pattern. We're also getting now a new 1 of a 9 to the downside with today's sell-off. So again, that could be starting a downtrend if we get further confirmation and a follow-through and start seeing more signals turn bearish. We'll be watching the gap fill area, gap lower today to see if that gap is filled immediately or not. S&P daily. This 9 count last week, and again, the 8 bar was the high of the count, and we've started to turn. NASDAQ did the same thing at the July top, but the NASDAQ daily chart already got a 13 countdown sell signal before we filled that gap. A half ago, again, down over here and over here again. When we were selling off, I told you eventually we're going to come back, fill this gap, but I was predicting the sell-off. We come back and get a lower high, and NASDAQ and S&P would move to a new all-time high. That's now happened. Now I'm looking for a top now that we filled the gap, and I told you we could either get a lower high and start a reversal, or you can get a divergence right here and go slightly higher and then get that reversal. And again, we went sideways. We got a lower high. We got the 13, we went a little bit higher. Over here, we got the 9 count, just like the S&P is getting a 9.9. Here, that 9 count marked the peak, and we dropped 16%. We didn't complete another 9 count of 13.9. We started to eat a 1 of a 9 to the downside. We got up to bar 4. Somebody asked me about this today. What's the count on the NASDAQ? Try to turn up. The bullish inside day, it was not really confirmed. We tried to do it yesterday with the rebound, but it wasn't a solid push above that area. It was just kind of right at it, and then now we're turning down. And right here, we have this trend line from the lows, going back to the August low, going back here to the September low. Here we are, the trend line is just directly below. So we'll be watching that trend line, the accelerated trend line. I'll show you that on the other chart in a moment. We did break that today on the NASDAQ. Starting another 1 of a 9 to the downside. This is telling us these back and forth counts. It's telling us we're either going sideways or now we're starting a downward move, one or the other. The momentum signal shifting. It's telling us we're either going down or we're going sideways.